Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Scott Stedman podcast. I hope you are having a wonderful day. And today we're going to be talking about a subject that doesn't really get talked about a lot, but is something that if you're a pastor or maybe if you're someone who has been part of your church for many years or you're new to a church, you may notice like, hey, there's some weird design flaws within the church, and especially when you're trying to do anything or do any type of restoration or repair or upkeep or trying to modernize your church. Sometimes these design flaws become a pain in the butt. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that. But joining me today in this conversation is my co-host Micah Current. Micah, how are you doing today?
Another day, another dollar.
Another well, the
Or
Scott Seven podcast. That's all we're paying is dollars here.
give us a 5-star review and a 5-star rating, and make sure you spread the word. Subscribe.
And I get my 4 quarters, and when you do that, every time a 5-star review comes in, Scott gets his quarters.
We get a quarter per quarter.
Get a quarter per quarter. Oh my gosh. Goodness. Oh boy. So as we're kind of our topic, as we're talking about these design flaws within churches, like Micah, do you have like any stories gone wild that have to do with a church that had like just a weird design flaw?
Yeah. So years ago, when I was in seminary, I did an internship at Humble Over Church in Middletown, Ohio, and um, that's where my parents got married. That's where Alicia and I got married. I worked there for a bit, both as an intern and then as a volunteer pastor, doing young adult ministry and youth ministry and stuff. But during my time as an intern, um, I was, primarily focused on worship, and the the worship team had bought an Aviom in-ear monitor system. And for those who don't know what a Aviom in-ear monitor system is, it's basically just it allows your team to have ears on stage, and you can plug your headphones into a box, and you can basically give your own personal mix without affecting the overall mix in the house. And so if Scott and I were playing on a worship team together and he was playing bass and I was playing drums, and I needed more bass guitar, I could select Scott's channel and turn the bass up if I wanted to, turn the guitar player up or the keyboard, whatever, and the overall volume. It's just a really nice system to mix your personal mix when you're wearing in-ears. And
Mm-hmm.
so as a part of that, we had to install, obviously the personal monitor mixers on the stage, but then we had to install the hub on the soundboard. And the way that
Yeah.
that works is that you run an Ethernet. It's almost like a router at your house for your internet, but
Mm-hmm.
it's a box that has Ethernet cables, and so basically you plug an Ethernet coming out of your soundboard into um, the Avion box up by your soundboard, and then you run another Ethernet cable to your platform that then sends signal to all your boxes on the stage. So theory that doesn't sound like a big deal. So the setup at Town Boulevard Church is that there's a balcony in the sanctuary. Have you ever been to Town Boulevard Church?
Many, many years ago.
Okay,
So,
so like it's a huge sanctuary, and you walk in and there's the balcony, and then like the stage and the huge auditorium. And so anyway, the soundboard and everything is upstairs, and everything, obviously for the worship team, instruments and stuff is on the platform. So we had to run one Ethernet cord from upstairs in the balcony to the platform.
hmm.
And the way that we did that was you had to run the Ethernet in the balcony behind the soundboard, and then like you had to drop it where the balcony, architecturally speaking, was behind the wall, and then out of the sanctuary through the drop ceiling. So like there was this wall, and we had to go over the drop ceiling, and then we had to send it straight up, and then all the way across the very top where the ceiling was, which is a drop ceiling in the auditorium, and then drop it behind the stage. and then up under the floor of the stage, and then up into the up where the floor was, where the stage is. There was about, I want to say, 500 foot of Ethernet cable that we had to run. Where the story goes wild for this particular illustration, when we moved the drop ceiling and looked
Mm-hmm.
up above the ceiling to where the wall was coming out of the sanctuary into the lobby area, it looked like somebody dressed up in a Spider-Man costume and just shot webs everywhere. And it wasn't spider webs. It was because the building's 50 or 60 years old and they had run old phone lines, and the multiple generations of pastors and leaders that have been through that church over the years had ran different, speaker wires and phone wires and XLR cables. And back in the day when Sunday school classes had like actual bells, right? Like in between classes, like
Yeah.
there was wires for the bells. But literally, Scott, it looked like somebody shot spider webs all over.
Oh, jeez.
And so, like, thankfully, the Ethernet cord was blue and it was the only one that we were running and we didn't lose track of it. But like, I could see how you could very easily lose track of, something up there because of how much stuff was up there. And I don't know why that, you know, through the course of time, they just didn't get rid of the stuff that they weren't using. They just left it there. Because I mean, it's one of
Yeah.
those things, right? Like if you have the drop ceiling and it's covered, you're not going to see it.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. And I mean, even like with older churches, when you start switching out old equipment for new equipment, and a lot of times I think in the mindset is, oh, well, I should be able to use the old wires or use the old cables to use it. And sometimes it doesn't necessarily work, or you realize, oh, they look really bad. We shouldn't use them. But then you don't clear it out. So a lot of times, like if you're like, I know there been a couple of times where I've done outdoor worship services. So I'd move our sound system outside and I had to like tag everything. And even after I tagged everything of where I was pulling it out, took pictures, did everything. So I knew how to hook everything back up. There would still just be random cables and stuff back there that I'm like, where does this go to? What is this for? Like, I don't know. It's just wild um just how something as simple as cleaning up an old cable doesn't get done. It just creates a bigger mess later when you're trying to install new stuff.
Well, and two, and I think that's kind of the beauty of like digital boards and sound equipment
Hmm.
now, is that there's way less wires and there's way less of a mess.
Yeah, absolutely. For my story's gone wild. It actually happened today. We have a alarm system at the church, and occasionally, in the mornings, I'll get a call from the alarm company. Usually, because like one of our preschool teachers came in um, and for some reason her passcode wasn't working, or sometimes someone comes through a different door than the main door, and it just kind of triggers an alarm. And or sometimes it could just be something random, like a bug crawling into a sensor and triggering the fire alarm, and the whole Columbus fire station is at your
You wouldn't know
front
anything
door.
about that, would you?
Oh, that's happened to me multiple times, but it's never fun. But anyway, regardless, we got to so this morning, my kids are up, I'm up, I'm getting breakfast, I'm eating breakfast, and I get a call from church security. I'm like, okay, what happened? And usually I'll get a call like, oh, somebody came in, but then they disabled the alarm and blah, blah, blah. It's like, all right, well, then we don't need to send the cops there. Well, this one was different. They said that the cops already there searching through the church. I'm like, that's interesting because that's never happened before. So I go over there. I can still hear the alarm blaring. I go in. The cop's standing right there. I'm like, here, let me turn this off. It's like, oh, thank you, because he's like literally covering his ears because it's that loud. I
Can you
went.
hear it from your house?
I cannot hear it from my house because again, the church is like all like big stones.
Yeah.
I can't hear it. The only time I can hear the alarm is especially when I get to the front door because that's where like the turn off is, but that's also where they have like the loudest sound right there. I don't know. I wish it would have like have it elsewhere because it's deafening when you're trying to turn that stupid thing off. So I go up there, and sure enough, it's like doot doot doot. Put in my code, thing goes off, and he was just telling me that you know, weekly the police will go to all the places of worship in the area, walk around, check, check the doors, check everything, mainly because of all the heightened stuff, especially with Israel and Palestine. Like a lot of the synagogues in the area get checked, so they just check all places of worship in the area just to make sure everything's safe, everything's kosher, there's no funny business happening. And he just happened to pull on the playground door, and it popped open and set the alarm. So he went downstairs and kind of looked all downstairs, checked everything, everything was fine, and then the alarm somehow came off because the security system um, people like kind of disabled it a little bit. And then right when he walked upstairs, he triggered a sensor, and then that's when the alarm started blaring again. And then I'm like, oh great. So then I went, shut the thing off, and talked. He's like, oh, I'm so sorry. I pulled on the door and it flew open. I didn't mean to trigger anything. I'm like, oh, it's okay. But I just thought that was funny because I usually don't get a call saying, "Oh yeah, police are already there walking around." I'm like, "Oh, that's weird," because usually they're on their way. They're not just there. But oh well. And I mean, a lot of it has to do with just the old doors because those doors are about 100 years old, and just if they don't latch all the way, very easily someone can pull that up. And thankfully, it was a cop and not like a kid on the playground who just like bumped into the door and pulled it open, and then the alarm's going off, and here's like a 5-year-old kid crying because they just set the alarm off at the church, and the police are coming to get him. Oh goodness. But oh well. Anyway, so with that being said, let's talk about design of flaws in the church. So to kind of set this off, like Micah, we talked a little bit about cables, we talked about old doors from our stores gone wild, but at the churches that you have served or the churches that you have been a part of, what are some of like the design flaws that you have seen where you go, you know, this is an issue?
Where to begin? I think before I answer that question, I think that I think it's important to note that um, a lot of churches build these buildings and they spend all this money on, whether it's a new building, new to them, whether it's 30, 40, 50 years ago, or in your case, Scott, the Bexley UMC church is several hundred years old. Um, like I think that there's this preconceived notion that people think that, oh, we've paid for this building, the mortgage is paid off, the building is the way it is, and it's the way that we wanted it. We don't need to, therefore, we don't need to keep it, keep upkeep on it. Meaning you don't have to update it. And by update it, I don't mean like knock the building down and start all over. I mean like interior design, as far as, keeping things up to code and like bathrooms, great example, making sure that buildings are up to code and staying somewhat in line with what current trends are. And I think that they fight those things just as much as they fight things like worship and some other things, sacred cows, if as we've talked about on the show
Yeah.
before. But are you talking just strictly design, or are you talking?
I mean, I think it's like one of those things like it's one of those things like you have a church building, and it was built. I think a lot of times when churches are built, they're built for the time to serve the community or the demographic or the members that attend the church at that specific time. Um, and other times there's some design flaws basically due to budget constraints.
Yeah,
So, for an example, I'll give an example. So, the church I'm at now, the way the church is designed is you have this big old building that's the sanctuary. It has like a fellowship center down in the basement, and then you have like the sanctuary on top, and then that's it. And then later they built this education wing, this 2-story education wing that goes from basement, first floor, second floor, and that's where all the offices, the preschool, Sunday school rooms, all that's over. And then you have your parking lot. So I guess originally when the church was planning on being built back in the early 1900s, the sanctuary where it's at now attention originally wasn't supposed to be the sanctuary. It was supposed to be part of just the education. That whole thing was supposed to be Sunday school rooms and everything else. The original sanctuary was supposed to be built where the parking lot is, because with the stained glass windows, when the sun rises in the east, you would get a lot of natural light shining through into the church to illuminate everything. Okay, cool. However, by the time they started building the church, that's when the Great Depression hit, and they had to kind of change things up. So now the place that's supposed to be classrooms is now their main sanctuary. And then over the time, when they started doing additions and adding on, they built the church in a way where you're not getting a lot of natural sunlight coming in. And because of that, the sanctuary is just dark. Like we have like lights in there, and we have stained glass windows on the other side, which is great when the sun's setting, you get a lot of light coming in. But for the most part, you walk into the sanctuary and it's pretty dark and there's not a lot of lighting in there. And even when you have a bulb that burns out, you have to get on like a lift to get up there to change the bulb. And sometimes, since they're using like more halogen bulbs, like sometimes they either work or they burn out very quickly. And it just got to a point where we just noticed that there was a lot of that there's now it's like certain spots within that sanctuary is very dark because we don't have adequate lighting in there. So that's kind of a design flaw. And now we're kind of at a point where it's like, okay, what can we do to make the sanctuary a little bit more brighter? Because even when we plug in all the lights and we get all the lights in up in the where they need to be, it's still dark.
Mhm.
It's still like, I mean you can see everybody, but you can still tell that it's not as bright or light as it can be.
Uh, Kind of the same situation, but kind of in the opposite lens. Um, with when I worked at Huber Heights Church in Dayton, the sanctuary was a circle, and they had this huge stained glass window off to the side of where the platform was. So if I'm looking at you, Scott, and looking straight, and you were where the platform was, right off to the right was this huge stained glass window, but there was also windows that went over around the circle of the sanctuary all through the top, right? And so like you couldn't do anything with lighting on the stage,
Hmm.
for live streaming or what have you, because it was too bright. Because the sun would shine just, during, and even like if it was raining and it was cloudy, the the light would affect how anything looked in that room. And God forbid you have a conversation about putting curtains up there to cover the light to help with lighting on the live stream, or um, just the lighting in general for the overall worship experience. But that was definitely a design flaw that I noticed at that church.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And then I think the other thing too is, anytime when I read like these, like, oh, what are things that you can do to improve your church or to make your church more appealing to visitors? Like I read stuff through like Carrie Newwolf or sometimes, and one of the things they always talk about is the bathrooms, which is surprising, like making sure that not necessarily that your bathroom's clean, but that your bathrooms have adequate space for people to use. And it's interesting because when I think about churches in general, like unless you were at like a church that has had like a full remodel, like very rarely some older churches you can go in there and maybe like in the women's restroom you have like maybe two stalls, and then in the men's restroom you have one stall and one urinal. But other than that, like the bathrooms are pretty small in some old churches. Whereas if you go to like, I know like the first time I went to like Meadow Park in Columbus, like I walked into the bathroom like, oh my gosh, there's like 8 stalls in here and 3 urinals. Like, what is this? It was almost like walking into like a venue. Like, look at all these bathrooms. And I find that fascinating because, like, for a church, like especially like a historical church like that where I'm working at, I don't know how you can make your bathrooms bigger
Yeah.
because then you're drilling through plaster. And again, like if you're on the second floor, there's no way you can expand. So we have like, I think we have like 4 bathrooms on the first floor. We have 4 bathrooms on the basement, and then we have 2 bathrooms. So it's just more of like just trying to point people like, hey, here's the bathrooms and here's kind of where you can go. Um, but I think back to the church I worked at in Virginia, and I don't think there was any way you could increase those bathrooms because either if you tried to make those bathrooms any bigger, you're either going to go into the stairwell or you're going to go into the administrative office, and then you wouldn't have an administrative office because you would have to make more bathrooms. And then in our fellowship center there, you had these bathrooms. You only had one stall in there, but they were huge. Like you could like they were just really huge bathrooms that you could like walk around and you know do stuff. It's like, well, you could probably put like another stall or something in there, but just again, the way they designed it and they wanted it to be kind of more home-like, more like family, like more homey, I guess. So that's why you walk into the bathroom, there's like pictures and some potpourri and something, and it doesn't look like an industrial, like an industrial bathroom. So I think in some ways, when you think about those little things, like sometimes just the way people designed the church and kind of even the mindset behind it may be good maybe be good in theory, but then when you think about the practicality of it, it just doesn't work very well.
Yeah, and a lot of times churches will build and they run out of money, and it's like, well, you probably should have thought that through, or you know, cut finances somewhere else, or budgeted better for XYZ. And I've seen a lot of churches where they spent money on, I don't know, the building and land, but they didn't have the money to build the full building. So like they're using, their sanctuary ends up being a multi-purpose room. Like it has, a gym, and it serves as a sanctuary, a gym, and a fellowship hall, all at one.
Hmm.
Because they don't have the money to build the sanctuary, but yet they want $2 million in debt for the land and the building that they did build.
Yeah.
One of the churches I worked at, I remember uh, my dad came to visit and I was leading worship, and he walked in, and the way that the building was designed is that you walk straight in, but the sanctuary entrance was kind of off to the right. But if you walk straight into the building, you wouldn't have known because it wasn't labeled. And so there was another door over there, and it was basically a custodial closet. So like my dad walked in, and it was like almost like he didn't know where the sanctuary was, and that was the first thing out of his mouth was like, they probably should label the doors around here,
Hmm.
because you could, and that was just a structural design that sanctuary is actually off to the right. It wasn't straight ahead when you walked into the church. And in most cases, when you walk into a church, the sanctuary is straight ahead, especially if you walk into some of these older churches and walk in the front door. Um, Man, what else? There's there's so many things I've seen over the years.
Oh, and the other thing, I think the other issue too is not just necessarily the design flaws of when they built it, due to it was kind of what they had at the time versus they had no money, so they had to make do with what they had, or they'd go, oh, we don't actually have the money to build a sanctuary, so we're just going to make this one room our all-purpose room and just do everything in there. The other thing is even when you try to do something within the space and you try to do anything to make it a little bit more modern or maybe a little bit more engaging to visitors, sometimes you just get pushback with any type of small changes.
Yep.
And I mean, the greatest example that I dealt with was, you know, at my last church I worked at, there wasn't really a welcome center for anybody to to be able to learn information about the church. So people would come in, the sanctuary's right there. They go in the sanctuary, but there wasn't anybody there besides someone who's giving you a bulletin and greeting you at the door. But there really wasn't anything where you could get more information about the church. Do this, do that. So there was all these things that was problematic. So one of the things I did is one of the visions we had was to build a welcome center. And we're just going to build a little welcome center kind of right next to the sanctuary doors, just off a little bit. Me and a guy named Jerry who worked in construction, like we looked at everything, we measured everything. I kind of said, here's kind of what I'm thinking. Here's kind of, and he's asking me questions because he's trying to understand things about how to build it and everything else. So needless to say, we all have like a good idea. Jerry at the time is on the administrative team, so he's the one who can make the decision with the rest of the team saying, hey, let's do this. So got approval to build this welcome center. And since Jerry worked in construction, one of the things he was doing, instead of just paying money to buy all the stuff and build the welcome center, he was just going to take supplies from other sites, the extra stuff from the sites, and he was just going to use some of the extra scrap to kind of build it. Okay, I don't have an issue with that. If that's something he can do and he can make it look nice, great. And he was showing me what he had. It was this it was this process where it was a slow process, but at least there was the plan that yes, we need a welcome center. We're going to build a welcome center. And then we finally have all the pieces in place. Jerry has everything. He's ready to build. So he starts to go and we start, and so we're in a meeting. He starts to talk about building this welcome center. And at this point, we've already had a change in team members on this team. And then someone's objecting to it, like, wait, what are you doing? And he says, oh, here it is. And we show him and we talk about the measurements. And this person was like, well, if we have a funeral here at the church, how are we going to get person in there? You're going to be blocking the aisle, the way for people to flow in here, and you're not going to be able to get a casket into the sanctuary. And I'm thinking, and I'm thinking, okay, I understand your logic, but when me and Jerry measured everything, there is at least a good 10 feet of clearance for people to walk through and at least walk through and move a casket into the sanctuary. Like that was a non-issue. So we're sitting here thinking about it. Well, then eventually people are like, oh, well, yeah, what would happen? Blah, blah, blah. So then they voted it down. After he got all the supplies and did everything, just trying to do whatever he can to build something nice for the church and not cost the church any money. And then all of a sudden it gets voted down. Like they voted down free welcome center, basically, because they're worried about all this stuff. And I'm still, even now I'm still kind of like, there is there's no way that shouldn't have been built. Like it wasn't going to interfere with anything. And yet, because someone had an issue, and I don't know if they just really had a legit concern or they're just using that as an excuse because they didn't want to have to change what the narthex looked like, because it was very tight and it was very small anyway. So maybe the illusion of, oh, it's going to be really compact once you put this thing there. But it also was a church that was averaging around 50. So it wasn't going to be tight at all. But it was one of those things where you're looking at stuff, and even when you're trying to do the best option and make the best plans to not take up too much space, there's still going to be some people who are just going to be objective to it because they're going to feel like, well, even though you're taking up a little space, that little space is a lot of space to them. Or it's changing the whole infrastructure of the church. And maybe some people are worried that, well, it's going to make things look smaller. Or if you start building something, then we may kind of get out of a grandfather clause with it. And then there might be a whole plethora of things that we now have to change because we're no longer grandfathered in because we made a small structural change. I mean, whatever. There's a lot of reasons why people are resistant to even trying to do little projects to kind of make the church a little bit more modern. So it's just one of those weird things that I just don't get. Um, so as far as all of you at home, like, what do you guys think? Like, have you ever been to a church where you notice something and you go, why is that here? Or, man, this is a really bad design. We would like to hear your stories. Maybe you're someone who works in a church and you've tried to make some changes or make some impacts, and you were met with either yes, and then maybe you had some resistance due to cost, or once you start really digging into everything, you realize, oh, this is going to be a much bigger project than what I realized, or maybe you just had resistance from your leadership team or your congregation. So, with all that being said, we like to hear your stories, and you can either comment on our social media pages. You can also send us an email at thescottstedman.org. We would love to hear from you. And again, friends, thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back on with another episode. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman Podcast. The Scott Stedman Podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman Podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.